All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is day 3 of Referendum, Proposition, Ballot Initiative Week, whatever you want to call it. Shed a tear, folks. It's coming to an end. I know this is the most exciting week of the year, but this day we go to 1978. We briefly referred to this in a previous episode because this is perhaps one of the most significant ballot initiatives in U.S. history, both because of its effect, but also because it came in this moment, as The Atlantic put it, of referendum fever. What we are talking about is Proposition 13 in California, an initiative that served as a backlash against rising property taxes. It had a massive effect. It cut and capped property taxes in the state. It also changed the rules by which new taxes could be put into place. So let's talk about Proposition 13, continue our conversation about the power and peril of direct democracy. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And we were talking about this right before we started recording, but we should say none of us live in California. We know that this proposition, a lot of California propositions, are so fraught and the fallout is so, ripple. There's the ripple effects and so forth. So, send us your letters if you feel like we didn't characterize this. But, we were very interested in this because of the nature of the proposition and also the fallout and what it teaches us about the sort of direct democracy conversations we've been having. But Prop 13 was a backlash against rising property taxes. Nikki, what is your understanding of why California voters in the late 70s were lashing back? Is that the word? Backlash? Lashing back.
Why the backlash was building. Yeah. Well, it was happening due to some pretty real conditions on the ground. Inflation in the 1970s would put inflation today to shame because it was so rampant, and housing prices and people moving to the state as well were creating a real boom in housing prices. And that put some property owners in a real bind because perhaps they had bought their house at a pretty inexpensive price. It's where they had planned to retire. Maybe now they were on fixed incomes, but their property tax bills had just gone through the roof. And many of them couldn't afford to pay their property taxes. And so there was an attempt by a right-wing activist, Howard Jarvis, to organize that discontent into this anti-tax proposition. And that's what Proposition 13 was, this idea that, first of all, you needed to cap property taxes, which has some complications because property taxes were used to pay for education, but also that you needed to change the ability of the legislature to tax people. And so they put in a requirement for a supermajority in order to pass any kind of new tax legislation, which has really hamstrung the California legislators' ability to tax people over the past, 40 plus years now.
Mm-hmm. It also made it so that you could only reassess property when you sold it or made significant changes, significant renovations or improvements to the house. And then it also basically said you can't have an increase of more than 2% annually. So you're not getting able to sort of squeeze a whole lot of juice out of that out of that orange, if you will, so that you can use those resources, use those taxes for other things. Like Nikki said, education, and education is a huge part of the way we think of property taxes.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up this, what I've always found to be a very baffling thing, that we tie schools to property taxes. But yes, when we talk about fallout of all this, that is a massive fallout of all this. But one thing worth noting here is, I think voters voted for this overwhelmingly. I mean, massive numbers. And I think for all the reasons that we described, it's understandable why so many voters wanted to curb property taxes. But this changing of the rules and the mechanism by which property taxes get increased, we touched on this a little bit with Josh, but like so many of these ballot initiatives, even when you walk in on a ballot initiative, you read it and the first couple sentences of it are like, okay, I get what's up here. And then there's this other stuff that's like about the mechanism. And that's often where I'm like, is this a poison pill? Is this really what this is about? What's the ripple effect here? And sometimes they're just so complicated and they're mashed together, and it's both an issue and a mechanism sort of lumped together. Yeah. And that could be really problematic, especially given, we didn't talk about this first, but especially given the way in which some of these are just worded so poorly.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And so, yeah. And not
we talk about the wording?
Yeah, not to imply that was necessarily the case here, though. Nikki, were you about to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say the worded poorly, but we shouldn't just chalk that up to people writing initiatives being bad writers. A lot of times these initiatives are worded the way they are to trick voters. That's not what happens with Proposition 13.
Right. Yeah,
but in more recent decades, this has been a technique to make people think they're voting for the opposite thing that they're voting for.
Oh, yeah. It's like vote yes to vote no.
Yeah, and then,
vote yes to vote no, and if you want whatever
it is. In New York, there's been like propositions to fix the way that propositions are worded, and those have been worded poorly, and you're like, what? So, yes. But before we get to the ripple effect and how California is in many ways still living with the legacy of Prop 13, or how has had to restructure the way it does taxes basically because of this. Nikki, I'm shocked you did not mention that this guy Howard Jarvis was a radio host.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that is just right up your alley.
Very much so. Like he truly was a conservative activist. He was somebody who had been part of the John Birch Society. He was somebody who understood the power of media for framing issues and the power of framing issues for exerting political power. And increasingly, people like Jarvis, conservatives like Jarvis, in California would be turning toward these things like propositions and initiatives because it was becoming a more democratic state. And so you would definitely see this in the 1990s with propositions that were anti-immigrant or were anti-affirmative action become much more popular because it becomes this way for conservative sentiments to be expressed.
Yeah, I think it allows conservatives who are living in a very blue state a sense of agency and a chance to kind of jump into the fray.
And to frame issues, because I think that was the other important thing that Jarvis does is he takes a discontent and he funnels it towards opposition to taxes, when you can imagine a different set of solutions for the economic challenges people were facing in the 1970s.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, we would be remiss to not point out that some of those discontents, as you put it, I mean, he has language about the moochers and the loafers who are coming into this state, and he refers to people coming into California, as locusts going through a grain field, and they get here and they destroy it. I mean, I think we kind of know what that language is getting at.
And very much dog whistles.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So clearly that's part of this as well.
And you can certainly get buy-in when you have a situation where your property taxes are higher than your mortgage. I mean, as a property owner, as a homeowner, it may seem like a no-brainer to not have to pay these kinds of taxes, or at the very least have caps on these kinds of taxes, restrictions, if you will. But the consequences of what happens as a result of this is also something that I don't think people fully anticipated, or at least appreciated, going into this.
Yeah. So, you have this moment of tax revolt. And I mean, think about 1978, 79, right? I mean, this really sets up the modern Republican Party in many ways. Ronald Reagan coming out of this era and coming out of California. Someone referred to Proposition 13 as the holy grail of tax revolt. And so that's clearly in the air. So there's this populist backlash against taxes, but then the specific fallout of what it does and how it affects California's budget capabilities is really the lasting legacy here. Where do we start with that?
I mean, one is this education issue. So the California Supreme Court, right before the passage of Proposition 13, had said you can still use property taxes to fund education, but you've got to distribute it more equitably. It can't be that people in low-income neighborhoods only get a few dollars for education. But then all of a sudden, Proposition 13 passes, and now there's very little money coming in for education anywhere. And so California falls from 5th among the 50 states in per student funding to 47th over the course of just a few decades. And it essentially guts public education in California because the tax base isn't there anymore.
Yeah. And it also makes these disparities even greater because wealthy communities can still supplement, their child's education. And oftentimes wealthy communities are sending their kids to private school. But for poor communities, for Black and brown communities, they're hit particularly hard. And it makes a situation that was already tough even tougher.
And that education disparity isn't the only disparity because white people are more likely to own homes and have intergenerational wealth in real estate. That cut to property taxes really redounds to white homeowners much more than it does to Black homeowners and Latino homeowners.
Right. So there's, some analysis done in the last couple of years that show what we've been discussing here, how there's been a huge housing shortage as a result of this, and it's contributed to the widening wealth gap. One analyst sort of framed it and said that, in the moment, it maybe saved the American dream for one generation, right? It allowed them to own property, but for subsequent generations, it made that dream tougher and tougher. And that is in many ways, kind of the story of generational change over the last 20, 30 years. All that said, there was one poll, and this is just one poll, but a poll last year found that 64% of California likely voters believe that Proposition 13 turned out to be a, quote, mostly good thing. 64% is almost exactly the number that voted for it originally. And so I don't know what we make of that other than, I don't know what we make of that.
It's not surprising that people don't want to pay high property taxes, especially in a state where real estate is so expensive. The idea that there's another bill on top of it makes sense that people don't want that. And there have been arguments that Proposition 13, because it allowed lower income people to stay in their homes, that it allowed them to realize larger gains when they ultimately sold their homes or when their family sold their homes, that it deterred gentrification. Because it kept more mixed income neighborhoods. But I think that the bottom line is that annual tax bill is not as high as it would have been otherwise.
Yeah. Right.
What I think is baffling, I mean, you gave some crazy statistics with California falling from like 5th to 47th. But as a result of the lack of property taxes, they basically had to create a new tax on the wealthy to pay for all of this education. Right. And so the top 1% earners now fund half of the state's income taxes, like half, which is not a good position to be in when you have such a small percentage giving you, most of your budget. That's wild.
Yeah. Two people move and all of a sudden you have lost lots of your tax revenue. And I think this is right, that in 2016, it was possible to create that surcharge because Democrats had a supermajority in the California legislature. And so they were able to overcome that hurdle that had been put in place by Proposition 13.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge, this taps into and is sort of running alongside a huge dire conversation about housing shortages in California right now and huge fights about not just taxes, but zoning and permitting and sort of the ability to build housing. To take a step back and as we wrap up here, I mean, we touched on it a little bit, but Nikki, I'm curious kind of, do you see the flow here, this tax revolt in California, it's the late 70s. Your recent book is looking at the 90s, but we've talked about how so much of like fear and paranoia and anger about taxation is at the heart of all of it. Like, where do you see the seeds coming from out of this fight into the stuff that you've been thinking about lately?
Well, Howard Jarvis appears on the cover of Time magazine in 1978, and in the article about him, it talks about the wave of the tax revolt crashing over the nation. So you do see these kinds of laws being passed in other states, but this anti-tax animus really sets the stage for Ronald Reagan. And this idea that government is the problem is very much wrapped up in the tax revolt. It's wrapped up in Reaganism. And then by the 1990s, what you're seeing is sort of, especially on the right, a kind of anti-tax theology, to the point where Grover Norquist's anti-tax pledge is signed by most Republicans who are in Congress in the 1990s. But more so, as I mentioned earlier, that this use of initiatives, sometimes for pretty anti-democratic ends, starts to become more popular because it becomes a way of allowing a small group of people to get a really big question on the ballot.
All right, that brings us to the end of this episode, and it brings us to the end of Referendum Proposition Ballot Initiative Week. I know.
Maybe we can make it an annual thing.
Yeah, maybe.
Quarterly? Maybe quarterly?
Quarterly. Maybe quarterly is in every 4 years. Quarter annual. But next week is going to be polling week. We're going to pick some very strange and fun polling stories. And the week after that, which is the week leading right up to the midterm election, we're going to look at some of our favorite midterm stories that made me feel like they have some resonance for now. But anyway, that's the plan. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.